Welcome to a tutorial about how to knit socks. My name is Mina and I am the host of the Knitting Expat podcast on YouTube, and occasionally I also post little tutorials on how I do certain things. I've been asked a lot lately about how I knit my socks, and I thought I'd do a little tutorial on how I get started knitting my socks 2 at a time and how I get set up, and doing a bit of an update on my yarn management video. I had posted a video a while ago now, a few months ago, about how I manage the 2 cakes of yarn when I knit my socks 2 at a time. I thought I'd start out by quickly running you through what tools and what materials I use to knit my socks 2 at a time, and this is basically what we will be talking through. I have a free Ravelry download pattern for how I knit my socks. It's called Mina's 2 at a time socks, and it's available for free. And yeah, so my standard sock, I'll quickly run you through the anatomy. I do a 20 row cuff, ribbed cuff. I switch between 2x2, 1x1 and 1x1 twisted rib, which is where you knit the knit stitches through the back loop, and that gives you the twisted effect. This is a 2x2. So knit 2, purl 2 rib. Then I do a plain stockinette in the leg, or whatever pattern I intend to use. I use a short row heel. For the most part I really enjoy a fish lips kiss heel. This one is my version of a German short row heel. It is a method that I am currently perfecting, and I will have a pattern for that eventually, and then there'll be a corresponding video. And then again I knit the foot plain, and I do a rounded wedge toe. Instructions for all of that are in the pattern. The pattern includes instructions for a standard wrap and turn short row heel, which you may or may not choose to use. The fish lips kiss heel is a separate paid for pattern by Socks Therapist on Ravelry. I will link that in the video description box for you. So that just gives you a quick idea of what a sock looks like, and how I do mine. And so, like I said, this is all explained in the pattern. So what this video will show you how to do is how I knit my cuff, how I cast on, how I knit my cuffs, how I get started on 2 at a time. I keep track of rows, I count rows, and I'll talk you through how I do that, and how I do my yarn management. What this video will not cover is the heel or the rest of the leg and the toe. I feel like the rest of the sock is relatively simple once you get started and you get the hang of the yarn management if you're choosing to do 2 at a time. Like I said, I will have a separate tutorial for the heel, and you can always substitute in whatever heel method you prefer. And then the rest of the foot is a lot like knitting the leg. If you're doing plain stockinette, then it's really simple, and if it's a pattern, you're just continuing it from the top. And the rounded toe, again, is a very simple process which is explained in detail in the pattern, and there are thousands of videos on YouTube for how to do the Kitchener stitch on the toe. I will link a very good one in the description box below as well for you if you need some help with the Kitchener stitch. Alright, so some of the tools and materials that I use. You obviously need yarn. What I do is I will take either a 100-gram ball or a skein of yarn. I first wind it into a single cake, like this, a single 100-gram cake, and then I use a set of kitchen scales, and then I wind off 50 grams onto my ball winder, and then I rewind the other 50 grams to get 2 equally sized cakes of yarn. And if the skein is slightly over 100 grams, it's not a problem. I just divide it in half and do half and half what it is. Then you have your needles, and for this video I am using Addi Turbo sock rockets in what they call a US 1, but it's 2.5 millimeters, which I believe is actually a US 1.5. I'm using this because this is a slightly thicker sock yarn, and the yarn that I'm using is, I don't know where I just put the label down, it is a wool mice yarn. Sorry, just found the label there. Wool mice is their twin base, 80% wool, 20% polyamide, in the blue Suzanne colourway. So I split my skein in half. I have my needles. I use a progress keeper, not only to mostly to keep count of the rows, and this is just a little butterfly one that a friend gave me. I have a set of 2 DPNs, which I only need when I am working on the cuff of my socks for the initial start of the socks before I get to the 2 at a time, and then a project bag, which becomes very handy for managing for the yarn management section, and so that will come into play slightly later in this video. Alright. Okay, so first off we're going to start with casting on, and I pull out a length of yarn, roughly one yard in length, sort of does it for me. And I don't use any sort of special cast on for my socks, I just use a regular long tail cast on. I cast on I cast on loosely. Now there's a misconception, some people think that to cast on loosely you cast on a size bigger needle. In fact, that's the wrong way to do it. A looser cast on isn't to do with the size of needle that you use, it's the space between the stitches. All that happens is if you use a larger needle, you have a larger stitch, but it is the space between the stitches which determines how stretchy your cast on is. So, you start with your slip knot, you pop that onto your needle, tighten it up, not too tight, just enough. And then you start casting on using a long tail cast on, like I said. And I always hold my the first stitch with my thumb. It's just a habit I've gotten into. And if you need a tutorial on how to do a long tail cast on, I will leave a link to one in the description box below. So as you are casting on, rather than pulling up nice and tight against the stitch like you normally would, I leave a couple of stitches gap between the stitches as they come on, so I don't snug them up right next to each other. And I'm not like particularly precise about it, I don't stress about them all being the same distance apart. I just try and keep it so that there's it like that. You can see they're not so close together like these first 2-3 stitches are. They have a bit of space between them, and that gives you a stretchier cast on. So just move them down and keep going. And cast on as many stitches as you will need, according to whatever pattern you are following. In this instance, on 2.5mm needles, I am doing a 56 stitch sock. That is what works for me and for my gauge and my measurements. Okay, so once you have your 56 stitches, or however many stitches you are casting on the needles, we are ready to join in the round. As you can see, the space between my stitches isn't always exactly the same as the stitch. They're not evenly spaced exactly the same, but you can see for most of them there is quite a bit of space between each stitch in the cast on, and that's enough just to give you a stretchier cast on, and it has always worked well for me. So I should have explained I knit my socks magic loop, so we will be magic looping from here on. And again, if you need a more detailed tutorial on how to knit magic loop, I will include a link for one in the description box below. So first, we're just going to count up to half the stitches, which for a 56 stitch sock is 28 stitches, and then pull the cable through. Get the stitches on the needles and make sure they are not twisted, that all the stitches are lined up correctly. So you can see all the knots or the cast on edge at the bottom is all at the bottom for both sides. There's no twists, everything's lined up. And then you just make sure that your tail is out of the way, and I keep the tail on the inside of the needle, see here, and then the working yarn is over the back needle. So the back needle will be the one which has the working yarn attached to it. Okay, and what I sometimes do is I just twist the tail around my middle finger just to keep it out of the way when I get started. And we're just going to do a 2x2 rib for this sock, just for ease. And sometimes the cast on row can be a little bit tricky, but if you've not cast on too tightly, it should be perfectly fine. And if you get stuff like this, these gaps forming, that is totally fine. That is what is giving you that stretchier edge at the top, so you don't have any issues getting your sock over your foot. And then once you've done a few stitches, you can let go of that tail. It's just to keep it out of the way for the first few stitches, and you don't even have to do that if you don't want to. I just find it helpful for my style of knitting. And as you can see, I am a flicker, and I will include a video link in the description box below. I've done a video on how I knit, explaining the flicking method and the way that I do it. It is by no means the only way to do it, but it is my method. Okay, end of one needle, turn it around, pull the yarn through. Sorry for the needle noises on the table. Make sure you don't twist the stitches again. The first round is just the one where you need to pay quite a bit of attention to make sure you don't twist stitches, and then after that it's usually quite simple. And then when I knit, a lot of people ask me about avoiding ladders and how I do that. To be honest, I'm not the best at avoiding ladders. I do still get them on my socks occasionally. I just don't let them bother me that much. But for the most part, you just want to keep an even tension at the beginning of each needle, and you don't want to pull too tightly, but you don't want it to be too loose. I always pull a little bit more snug on the second stitch rather than the first stitch, which usually helps. But like I said, even if I do get ladders, most of the time it comes out with blocking, and even if it doesn't, to be honest, it's just a pair of socks, it's going on your feet, no one's really going to see it. Alright, and then we come to the end of the row, end of the round, and as you can see, you have this big gap here. And I've had a few people contact me saying, is this a problem? Like, am I doing something wrong? No, you're not. It is totally fine. Don't worry about it. That evens itself out after a few rounds. And I get it on every single pair of socks that I've ever knit when I first start the cuff. Another thing I didn't explain was why I knit my socks in this method. I prefer knitting my socks 2 at a time because, frankly, I don't want to be struck with second sock syndrome, and I know it is definitely something that I would be affected by. However, knitting socks 2 at a time, cuff down, the cast on can be quite tricky, and as you have seen, you don't want to twist the stitches, and it can be quite fiddly for the first few rows to try and knit 2 cuffs in ribbing, whichever style you chose, at the same time. It is definitely easier to knit, in my opinion, it is definitely easier to knit the cuffs 1 at a time and then put them onto the same needles, which is what I'm showing you here. So just going to keep knitting the first cuff. And I just want to show you that that gap in the stitches will close after a while. So I'm just going to knit a few more rounds, and I will probably speed this up so that you're not going to have to sit here and watch me knitting for 5-6 minutes. So you can see here after 4 rounds that that super looseness between the 2 needles on either end has sort of tightened up a bit, and this will tighten up further as you keep going. It is not that obvious, and then you tie in this, you weave in this end at the end, and it closes that gap. Another quick tip for counting rows in ribbing, I find it is much easier to count the purl bumps than it is to count the knit stitches. So you have 1 bump there, 2 bump, 3 bumps and 4 bumps. Not sure how clear that is in this yarn, but the 4 bumps will tell you that you've done 4 rows. The reason I don't count the knit stitches is because if you count the knit stitches here, you'll read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the 1 on the needle. And the reason for that is the first knit stitch is actually your cast on row. So to avoid confusion, I always count my purl stitches, the purl bumps, when I am counting my rows in ribbing. And something I forgot to mention earlier is with knitting socks 2 at a time, my preferred cable cord length is 40 inches or 100 centimeters. So I will take a break here and I will come back once I have finished the first, the ribbing on the first cuff. And I prefer to do 20 rows, but you can obviously knit that as long or as short as you would like. Okay, so I am back now and I have finished the ribbing for the first cuff. Like I mentioned before, I tend to do 20 rows of ribbing. In this case, I've chosen to do 2x2 ribbing. And on a side note, I'm really liking how this yarn is spiraling up with the pooling. Right, so what do I do after I've finished the first cuff? And what I do is I transfer the stitches onto DPNs. You can use scrap yarn if you'd like, but I find DPNs actually make it a lot easier to then go back to working in the round. I mean, when you come to put the stitches back onto the magic loop needle. So all I do is just one at a time, split the stitches over. And the size DPN I'm using is a 2mm or US 0. The size of the DPN doesn't really matter as long as it is the same or smaller than the needle you are knitting with. So just a reminder, I am using sorry, a 2.5mm or US 1.5 needle to knit these socks with. So slipping them onto 2mm DPNs. And I pretty much use a 2mm DPNs for all of my socks in terms of holding them. I just find it's easier to have a slightly smaller needle to pick up the stitches from afterwards. And again, I find it easier to transfer stitches back from a DPN than from scrap yarn. But that's just personal preference. Like I said, you're more than welcome to use either. So once your stitches are on your DPNs, I just tend to stick them in the cake, bring the second ball in and get ready to cast on and knit your second cuff. So I will join you back once I have done that and knit the second cuff, and then we will go into putting the first cuff back onto the needles and getting started working 2 at a time. Alright, I'm back again, and now I have finished the second cuff as well. And something I also wanted to show you was, if you remember at the beginning when we first cast on and there was the slight, you know, the stitches between the front and back needle was looking quite stretched. It looked like there was a really big gap there, and I said that after a while that works itself out. So you see, once you've finished the cuff, it doesn't look, so that would be the join here, it doesn't look any different than the rest of the ribbing, and you don't get any noticeable gaps there. So don't worry about it if that happens to you. That happens to everybody, as far as I know. The first couple rows, that join where you're joined in the round for magic loop, that stitch can be a little bit loose, but it works itself out, and I didn't do anything special for that. I just wanted to show you that after the 20 rows were done. Right, so when you come to actually putting the first cuff back onto the second cuff, there's a couple of things you need to think about. Let's move the project back out of the way for now. You want to make sure that if you're looking at your stitches here, you've got the working yarn going over the back. You want to make sure that when you're putting these stitches back on, you're putting them on in the same direction, so that, you know, the working yarn is on the right hand side on the back needle, like that. So you see they're both on the going over the back needle, that you're not putting your stitches on this way with your working yarn on this side. You just want to, because that's the wrong orientation and it will mess up the actual knitting. So yeah, you want to make sure that you're putting the stitches back on in the same orientation as they are currently on the needles. For me personally, I am right-handed, so I find it a lot easier to do this transferring stitches from the left to the right-hand needle. So I'm just going to turn this whole thing around. And just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to pull out one needle there, and I hope it won't make too much noise. So I'm going to start with the side that has the working yarn attached to it, and I'm on the same side on this needle. So just transfer those stitches back onto the magic loop. Just slip them back over. Just be careful you don't drop anything, or you don't split any stitches as you're going. Just slip them over, nice and easy. And then I pull this needle through so that, you know, I don't accidentally drop anything, and it's also easier to deal with that there, so the needles don't make noises. And then pull the other cable, get that needle into a few stitches just so it's easier to manage, and you transfer the second set. Stitches over. Like I said, you can do this from a piece of scrap yarn or even another cable needle. You just want to make sure that you are transferring the stitches over in the same orientation. Then pop your needle back into the stitches and we will get ourselves situated for some magic loop knitting. Okay, there we go. We are on. Both cuffs are orientated the same direction. You've got the working yarn coming off them in the same way. Now the first things you want to do is make sure your yarn isn't twisted. So you can see here the yarn is twisted, so scooch that round, make sure you've got the working yarns going to the ball in the right direction. And this is where I find using a project bag is quite handy. So this is one of my project bags that I make and sell in my Etsy shop. This is my medium wedge, which is perfect for 2 at a time socks. What I do is I turn the top down to make like a little bucket, and then I stick the balls, the 2 50-gram balls or half skeins, into the bag. Move the DP ends out of the way. And then this is how they always sit. And then when I'm done with my sock project, I'm going to put it away, and I put it in the same direction. You know, I don't twist the yarns. I wouldn't turn it and put it in that way. I make sure that the strands are straight before I put my project away. And then I knit from the bag like this, always making sure that my yarn is untwisted when I begin. Okay, so let's begin. So we start knitting in the round, much like we did when we were knitting one cuff at a time, but this time we're going to be knitting just in plain stockinette. And again, if you are knitting a pattern sock, you would be knitting whatever pattern the project calls for. Split that stitch, that's fine. So just knit across. First sock, and drop that yarn at the front, pick up the second yarn for the second sock, and you just knit across. Nice and simple. Okay, and get to the end, you drop the yarn to the front, turn, and the way I turn from, I turn to the front, so with the yarn, with the needle point coming towards me and to my right, so from left to right. So that's after I've knit the front stitches. Then I get myself set up again to knit the back stitches. And at this point your yarn is crossed, but that's okay. You can see there the yarn is crossed. That's fine. Knit across the back stitches. Again, drop that to the front, pick up the yarn at the back, knit across the second cuff, second leg, another stitch. Okay, and drop it into the front, and then what I do at this point is I turn the needle away from me. So first turn, when you finish the front you turn towards you, when you finish the back you turn away. So you go from left to right, away from you, that direction. But in the process what I do is I pick up the working yarn, I turn it away, sorry it's getting tangled there, pick it up, I turn it away, and then I put it over the needle. And this method, sorry, dropped it. This method untangles the yarn, so your yarn is no longer crossed. And I will knit a couple more rows to show you how this works. The yarn, as you can see, is kinking up on itself. That's really not a problem. It doesn't bother me that much. It's just to do with the way the yarn has been caked up, I imagine. And I'm not entirely sure why that happens with some yarns and not with others, but it does. It's not really that big a deal. You just keep going. So finish the front, both working yarns in the front of the work, turn the needle towards me from left to right. Then you pull the needle back through. Sorry if I shook the camera there. And pull the back needle out, get ready to go again. Yarn in front, pick up from the back. Yarn in front. You see here, you pick up the working yarn, turn the needle away from you, put the yarn down back behind the needle, pull through, you're ready to start again, and your yarn is not tangled. Okay, and the reason why I like using the project bag is it stops the yarn rolling around, especially if you're pulling from the center or if you're pulling from the outside of the ball. It just keeps your work nice and neat, your yarn neat, and it's just easy to pick up, knit, and you know your yarn is always separated this way. Even if you get these little curly bits in your yarn, they're not actually tangled. Just a little pass a hand through and it will separate quite easily. Yeah, and you just keep knitting in the round like that, making sure when you finish the front you turn the needle from the left to the right towards you, turning the point towards you, and when you finish the back stitches you turn the needle away from you, flipping the yarn over the needle to untwist it. And that way you can keep knitting round and round without getting lots of tangles in your yarn. If you happen to pick up the project after you've put it down and you happen to have picked it up and there's a twist in it, I always try to make sure to check my yarn before I start knitting. Before I start knitting, and if I notice there's a twist in it, that you can see here, that I've got a twist in it, I just untwist it, either by turning the needles or by just untwisting with the yarn, and then you're good to go. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and knit a few more rows, and then I will show you how I use my progress keeper to keep track of where I am. Okay, so now that I've done a few rows, I'm going to show you how I use my progress keeper to keep track of my rows. So I'm just using a DPN here to show you what I'm looking at. So to count rows after in your knitting, if you're not sure, each of these V's is a knit stitch, and if you're counting after ribbing, sometimes it's hard to tell if you're looking at the knit column where the ribbing row ends and the stockinette for the leg begins. But again, if you look at the purl stitches, and I'll try and spread this out a bit more for you, you can see this is the last purl bump, and then the yarn, so you see this green stitch here underneath the purl bump, that is part of the purl stitch. So this blue stitch here is the first row of stockinette that I've knit. So I count from there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and 13 with the row on the needles. So normally what I do is I will put in a stitch marker, a progress keeper, about every 10 rows. Sometimes more, sometimes less, it just depends on how I'm doing. So I just pop it in through the stitch, and sometimes I'll try and catch 2 stitches, or 1.5 stitches in this case. And this stops it from pulling too much on one stitch alone. Sometimes I've found if I have a progress keeper in just one stitch after a few rows, especially if it's one that's got a little bit of weight to it, it pulls that stitch quite tightly and then you get a loose stitch. Whereas if you pass it through 1.5 or 2 stitches, it won't loosen that stitch too much. And the second thing I wanted to show you was how stretchy the cast on is. So like I said, we did the long tail cast on and it looks quite pretty when you look at it from above. But it's also incredibly stretchy. You can see how stretchy that is. So this is just a very regular, normal long tail cast on that we did at the very beginning of the video. And you just see that leaving slightly bigger spaces between the stitches that you cast on gives you all the stretch you need. At least it does for me. There are alternative cast on methods like German twisted cast on and some other cast ons that give a stretchier edge, but like I said, I've never had any trouble with just the plain simple long tail cast on, and I hope that has been useful for you. And you just keep knitting like this, and like I said, every 10 rows or so I move the progress keeper up, and that helps me keep track, and sometimes I keep a tally going for every 10 rows, and typically I have this written in my pattern as well. Typically I will knit the leg of the sock somewhere between 60 and 80 rows before I put in the heel. And when I knit a heel, I use the short row heel, be it the regular short row heel, fish lips kiss heel, or German short row heel. And I knit them on the socks 2 at a time, so you knit one heel back and forth on the same set of needles, leaving the other sock just to hang there, and then once you finish the first heel you move on, you knit the second sock, leaving the first sock to hang there. There's no need to take socks off the needles for that process. However, if you are doing a heel flap and gusset, I do find that the increased number of stitches can make it quite tricky, and picking up the stitches after doing the gusset, after doing the heel flap, can be a little bit difficult and a bit tight on magic loop with 2 socks at the same time. So if you are doing that, I would recommend you take 1 sock off the needles, do 1 heel flap gusset, and do the gusset decreases, then change over and do the 2nd sock before going back to doing 2 at a time magic loop. I generally believe that that would be a much simpler process if you would like to use a heel flap heel. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers all of the everything that I wanted to cover in this video, and I hope that this will be useful for you and you'd be able to successfully get started on knitting socks 2 at a time. Thank you very much, and please do let me know in the comments if you have any further questions.